Something's supposed to be happening. I don't know what it is. I'm just going to close everything and start over. Well, I thought I was going to. Oh, that's the problem. Someone could have told me.
You can do that.
No, because this is on a different disk. All right. There we go. So, stuff that is not serotonin, right? Aggression, I hope you, at some point during this semester, get the concept that aggression is a complicated sort of topic, right? Anybody taking, I was actually talking to Dr. Goel today about this. Anybody taking her social psychology class? Yeah, so she kind of gives you like the 2-slide version of aggression, right? And that's because it is a complicated story. B, it's kind of nested within a bunch of other fields, right? We haven't really talked about any social psychology aspects of aggression yet, right? And the reason for that is because we've been spending some time talking about chemical things and hormone. We'll talk about hormone things sort of moving forward in a week or so. We've talked a little bit about genetics. There are a bunch of aspects to aggressive behavior, right? And so because of that, it's a pretty complicated topic. There's a lot to it. The components that drive aggressive behavior are very complicated as well, right? So I think hopefully at this point, you've recognized that aggressive behavior is beneficial in certain cases, right? But it's also harmful in certain cases. And if we kind of go back to that first lecture, we talked about how important it is to properly evaluate the situation, right? And that evaluation of the situation is what's essential, okay? So we have to do evaluation, and then we do some sort of action, right? And because you can have aggression for different reasons, we talked about mates, we talked about food, we talked about shelter, right? We talked about all of those things, and there are still things yet for us to talk about, right? We did not talk about like offspring, okay? We've not talked about maternal aggression yet. There are a variety of different reasons that you might perform aggressive behaviors, right? Reasons you might be aggressive. And when you do those aggressive behaviors, you have a pretty broad selection of things you can do, right? You can puff out your chest. You can shoot urine out your eyes. You can, clack your claws together, or whatever it is you want to do, right? Spread your, right. I mean, all kinds of things. You have so many options, again, given the situation, given all of these contexts, right? So if you think about that, you think, well, if all of these things are so complicated, there must be many complicated things running underneath of that to control this, right? And there are. One of those, sort of the big guy that we're going to think about a lot, is going to be serotonin. There's one other major chemical that we sort of gave a little preview to at some point, and that's testosterone, right? And we're going to talk about androgens, testosterone, in particular in a week or so. So we'll talk about that specifically. But there are a few other things that we should discuss that are related to aggressive behavior. This is one of those days where I want you to get details, but I don't want you to get details, right? So you have to find this space in the middle, right, of understanding, because you can really get bogged down with very, very fine situations on this, right, and too many details. But at the same time, there are a few key things that you need to know, that you need to take away from this, right? So when we're thinking about neurotransmitters, there are different classes, different categories, right? This is not terribly important to a lot of you, but this particular class that we're interested in are called monoamines, right? How many of you have ever heard of MAOIs? Yeah, like any medication that you've taken over the counter, it says if you're on an MAOI, don't take this, right? So if anybody read, nobody reads. That's what I thought. So if you look at the label of, well, pick a medication. I mean, it can be an antacid, pain reliever, cheese. I know that's not a medicine, but it's on cheese. Should be on cheese. MAOI is monoamine oxidase inhibitor, right? I could write that out for you if you want. What does it do? What does an MAOI do? It inhibits monoamine oxidase, right? What's monoamine oxidase do? It chops up monoamines, okay? So basically, it takes whatever monoamines you have. In this case, typically we're thinking about dopamine because that's usually why you're taking an MAOI, is to affect your dopamine levels, possibly your serotonin levels, but we'll think about that another time. And it chops up dopamine into things, or it inhibits, the monoamine oxidase chops up dopamine, so dopamine no longer has an effect, right, Zach? So dopamine's pretty awesome, does things for you. If you're a little short on dopamine and you take an MAOI, guess what? That little bit of dopamine you have, it hangs around a little longer, so it does a little more for you, right? Instead of wearing out so fast, right? So it's about like buying an extended warranty on your dopamine. So it lasts a little longer, has a little better effect for you, okay? So in result, it's going to increase monoamine levels. Why do they put warnings on labels? Well, MAOIs really, they start to screw around with a bunch of stuff in your body, and especially if you start eating fermented foods, it can really cause you some problems. So if you're on an MAOI, no wine and cheese parties. And I know that's like at the top of your list, right? I mean, you don't even know what a wine and cheese party is, so that's why you're not even laughing. It's like beer and whatever that stuff is that came out of a tub in your refrigerator. You can't eat that stuff, okay? If you're on an MAOI. Is that helpful?
Is it like the tannins that interact with it?
It is. It's jeez. And there are so many things you shouldn't eat if you're on an MAOI. They'll typically not give you an MAOI if they can help it. They'll try all of these other classes of drugs first, and then finally, if nothing else works, they're like, well, we'll give you this, but here's like a list of things not to eat. So you can have water, and you'll probably be okay. And that's it's not quite that bad. But if you are on an MAOI, you should really watch those dietary restrictions and interactions with other medications, right? So you can cause some problems. But anyway, so monoamine oxidase. That's a little side story about monoamines. Some of you have probably heard of these neurotransmitters. Anybody heard of norepinephrine? Aspen, I expected a hand to go up there. Dopamine, glutamate, and GABA. It's not usually called confusing GABA, but in this case, we'll call it confusing GABA.
MAOIs. Do you know a brand name?
Brand name for MAOIs. Let's see. Keep those for a moment. Google knows what I want. This is probably, I don't know if I trust this particular website for anything else, but see that I'm already mad with it. We're just going to move on. Drugs.com. They're usually not too bad about advertisements. What are monoamine oxidase inhibitors? Here you go. Here's some brand names of monoamine oxidase inhibitors.
I think Serotonin is probably the only one that I've ever seen anymore.
Yeah. No, there really aren't too many of these that they give you. Let's see. Is that list helpful?
Actually, no.
Okay. Yeah.
I've heard of any of them.
Yeah. And the reason again is because they don't typically prescribe these anymore. If you're going in for like, why would you take an MAOI? Typically, we're thinking about depression and anxiety, right? If somebody's dealing with depression or anxiety, what's a drug class they give you instead? They'll typically start with an SSRI, right? Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. You guys familiar with those? I mean, there we go. So there's probably a list of these you've actually heard of, right? Like Lexapro, Celexa, Prozac, Zoloft. These are pretty standard things, right? That folks are. There are some that you've probably never heard of, but they just, different versions. They'll give you an SSRI first. If that doesn't work, then they'll try some other things. They'll finally get down to the MAOIs. So I'm going to guess most people aren't on an MAOI. You'd know if you were, hopefully. Hopefully you'd know if you were. All right. Let's talk about norepinephrine a little bit, right? It's got a really interesting abbreviation. That's NE, just in case you were curious, norepinephrine. What's norepinephrine normally do for you? Anybody know?
Isn't it like alertness?
Yeah, right. So there, norepinephrine, and then it's got a very, very structurally similar neurotransmitter called epinephrine. They actually go by two other names sometimes, noradrenaline and adrenaline, right? And so most of you think about an adrenaline rush. You've kind of experienced that before. You at least saw someone do it once on YouTube, right? So you're aware of what that is. So norepinephrine is one of these guys that's involved in aggression. Dopamine, we should talk about dopamine briefly. Dopamine's also involved in aggression. Dopamine's got sort of an interesting story. Dopamine we typically think of as that reward pathway, right? So it's kind of a reinforcing. You do something that feels good, you get a little drop of dopamine in some certain brain regions, right? What's also really interesting is how many of you have ever been in a situation where you were anticipating some sort of threatening behavior from another individual? Right? Right. It happens. Okay. It's even if it doesn't happen, right? You've walked down the street and you've kind of been on alert a little bit, right? Anticipating, somebody to jump out from behind a trash can, right? Because it happens sometimes. I would be careful where you walk, right? Dopamine's involved in that anticipation as well. So what's interesting about dopamine and norepinephrine both is that sometimes more makes you more aggressive, and sometimes less makes you more aggressive. And I know that doesn't really clear up anything for you at all, right? So that kind of goes back to my point that aggression's pretty complicated. It's controlled by a variety of brain regions, right? Some of these, more dopamine is a good thing. Sometimes less dopamine's a good thing in terms of driving aggressive behavior. Don't want you to get too caught up in that. I do want you to think about dopamine increases during anticipation of these aggressive interactions, right? Which really, typically we think of dopamine again in that reward pathway, which is kind of an interesting thing that you would have an increase of dopamine in a situation where you might not immediately think of that as being rewarding, right? Like, why would it be rewarding to be in an aggressive situation? Now, later we will talk about things like conditioned defeat. We'll talk about like what happens to you if you keep winning, right? So how many of you think winning's pretty awesome? How many of you think losing sort of sucks? Okay, yeah. I mean, you can skip that week because that's what we're going to talk about, right? But there's some internal things going on there. Dopamine level changes being one of those, right? So we have that anticipation of that aggressive interaction is going to drive up dopamine levels a bit, right? And if you think about that, that sort of makes some sense. Right? Shouldn't I be alert? Shouldn't I be ready? Shouldn't I be signaling that this is something important? And really that seems to be the importance of dopamine, right? Dopamine says, hey, something important is about to happen, or hey, something important just happened, right? And so when dopamine levels go up, you're like, bam, I bet something important's about to happen, okay? So that's kind of a signaling molecule. That's a little more nuanced story than you get in the, anybody take probably one of my other classes, and I told you all it does is reward, right, Aspen? And Mason, I think that's probably what I told you too.
What's that?
I probably told you dopamine was only involved in reward pathways in that addiction studies class that you had with me. But it's a slightly nuanced story, right? Anybody take learning, like a learning class? Yeah, how was that? You don't have to answer. So hopefully he talked about dopamine and reward pathway a bit in there, right? But dopamine is a little more nuanced than that, and we didn't really figure that out until we noticed that it was increasing in aggressive anticipation of aggressive interactions as well. Up until then, it was like, oh, dopamine, just reward, and I was like, wait a minute, maybe dopamine is saying, hey, something important is happening, right? Pay attention to this. This is something that's biologically salient. And if you think about reward pathways, learning pathways, and this anticipation of aggression, that story really lines up nicely for dopamine there. All right. Questions about either of those?
Does dopamine is it just released in the anticipation or also in the completion of the important?
Yeah. So yeah, both. And we'll talk about the back half of that later, right? Right now we're just thinking about you walking into that cage match, right? We're not going to talk about when you walk out with the belt. That's going to be later, okay? So that's like round 2. But yeah, absolutely, right? So if you continue to win, and that's something not just, I'll give you a little preview, not just will dopamine levels go up, but testosterone levels will go up, other things will kind of go up as you continue to win, right? So it's sort of there are only a couple times in your entire life that you will experience a positive feedback loop, biologically speaking. For a number of you, that's automatically like cut in half because you don't have a uterus. For some of the rest of you that do have a uterus, you're probably not going to get like an entire person lodged in there at some point, right? Like you're not going to have a kid. So for those of you that do, that's the only other. It's really the biggest example of a positive feedback loop, that and continuing to win, right? So there's a positive feedback loop with oxytocin. Aspen, you can tell them all about that if you want. No? Okay. It's a fun story, right? No answers. That's fine. Aspen was in my physio class, and we talked about it. That's why she knows about that. Maddie, you're in that class. Wait until we get to chapter 10. It's going to be thrilling. It's going to be great. Half the class won't show up. That's the half that read ahead and saw the syllabus. The other half who didn't, they'll accidentally show up. Nobody likes to talk about reproduction in a group setting. I don't know why. I have no idea. People are embarrassed by it. All right. So dopamine, norepinephrine. Those are good questions, Zach. What about glutamate? So serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, we don't always think about these guys as exactly always positive or always negative. They kind of have interesting effects left or right, up or down, whatever. Glutamate, on the other hand, though, is almost always excitatory. Okay. For those of you that know just a little bit about how your brain cells work, it's going to open ion channels for positive ions, right? And it's going to flood in some positivity, cause you to fire some action potentials, right? Hopefully in your intro to psych class they talked about that just a little bit, right? Did that happen, Caitlin? You don't think so? Who taught that class? I'm going to take a note. It wasn't me, I know that.
No, I haven't seen it.
Oh, okay. We'll cut him some slack. I don't know who it was. Glutamate's going to be excitatory. It's going to drive activity. If you are sort of ramping up the activity of cells in your brain, what do you think the effect on aggressive behavior is going to be? It's going to increase aggressive behavior. That was a straightforward answer. Right, no shock. So it's going to drive up aggressive behavior. Not a big deal. What is a little confusing, and if you didn't know that it was confusing before I put the word confusing up there, I put it there for you, is something called GABA, which is gamma-aminobutyric acid. We typically think of GABA as, inhibitory, okay, and it opens chloride channels, right, which is a negative ion. So typically it reduces activity levels of brain cells, right? And you think, well, if I'm reducing brain activity levels. I just told you if you excite the brain, right, with glutamate, it's going to increase. Well, if I'm going to reduce that brain activity, then definitely I'm going to reduce aggressive behavior, right? Yeah, up until the point that you're wrong about that, right? Because there's a point where you're going to be wrong. And there's a really great example of this. How many of you are aware of the relationship between alcohol and aggressive behavior? Yeah, so as alcohol goes up, aggressive behavior goes up, right? That's a pretty straight and easy story to tell, right? And just about every sort of study that's ever looked at this has come to that conclusion, right? However, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense here with this GABA story, right? Because alcohol actually activates GABA channels, which has an inhibitory effect, right? But sometimes there's this concept of inhibiting the inhibitor, right? And so that might be just a little bit confusing for a moment, but let's think about your car, right? And what's one way you can make your car go faster? It's like hitting the accelerator, right? And if you want to stop your car, you're going to go, oh, I'm going to hit the brakes, right? It's that simple, okay? And so if you have some sort of braking effect, right? So you think, well, I'm going to turn something off. Now, there are ways you can turn things off that actually, in fact, allow you to go faster, right? So what if, you know, think about something in your car that might also be an inhibitor on your speed, would be like your parents when you're learning to drive, right? Okay, they're not directly hitting the brakes, but they're making you hit the brakes, right? What happens when you get your parents out of the car? Speeding tickets, right? How many of you have had a speeding ticket with your parents in the car? Like nobody, right? It just doesn't happen. Okay, you drive below the speed limit, you take it easy, your parents are old, they've got brittle bones, you got to be careful with them, right? I don't know if that's true. But you don't get speeding tickets with your parents because they're an inhibitor on your driving fast, right? But if you inhibit that inhibitor, so you get them out of the way, put them in the back seat, put a blindfold on them, you know, stick them in the trunk. I don't know what you do with your parents. It's up to you. You can drive faster, right? And so GABA is like that sometimes. It turns off inhibitors, right? It inhibits the inhibitor, and so in fact some cells become more active, and you actually can increase aggressive behavior with increases in GABA. Questions about that? It's not so bad, right? Basically, if it's a neurotransmitter other than serotonin, it can increase or decrease aggressive behavior. I know, right? It was like a lot there just to tell you that. There are a ton of nuanced situations, right? So like, well, what about increasing dopamine? What if I've already sort of found an animal that's aggressive? And then what happens if I give it amphetamine? Is it going to become aggressive because of increased dopamine? But what if it wasn't aggressive before and then I give it amphetamine? Is it going to be aggressive? Well, it's two different things, right? And so you're creating these sort of two different situations, which really, I think, tells you how little we know about aggression, how much we know about aggression in some ways, right? Because we can really talk about these very nuanced and sort of weird situations, right? But at the same time, trying to apply that, and I think this is why Dr. Goel gives you the 2-slide version, right? Because it's the end result is like, hey, sometimes people are aggressive, and sometimes they're not. Good luck. But there are some things we do know, and so hopefully we can continue to talk about those. There's one other molecule I'd like to spend some time talking about, and that's nitric oxide, also known as the miracle molecule. I don't want to see hands go up. How many of you have ever taken a medication, taken an over-the-counter drug, taken something that has been said to increase nitric oxide levels? Again, you don't have to answer that. I know some of you are looking at me strangely, like, why wouldn't I want you to answer that, right? So there are a number of things that you might purchase. Anybody been down the workout supplement aisle? Yeah, there's like a ton of like nitric oxide boosters, right? Like, oh, it helps with vasodilation, and it does. Anybody been down the, I don't know, I guess it's probably almost the same aisle, isn't it? I mean, I don't know. Sex supplement aisle? Yeah, one of the number one things that Viagra does is increase nitric oxide levels. Again, being a vasodilator, you could kind of think briefly about why that would be an advantage or why that would help that medication to work. So nitric oxide has a ton of uses sort of peripherally in the body, but there's also some uses in your brain. It's actually a great signaling molecule, right? It's very small. It's just nitric oxide, NO. Maddie, just a few days ago, I told you something that changed your life, and that was lipid solubility. You remember that discussion, right? Not all the rest of you know about lipid solubility. As soon as you know about lipid solubility, your life will change, right? Because this is how your body works. Things that are lipid soluble slide in and out of your cells pretty quickly, right? This is one of the reasons, and we'll talk about later some pharmacological interactions with aggression, right? This is, if you've ever taken a substance that has affected your brain function, right? And you don't have to answer that if you have. A lot of you have, right? If you've ever taken alcohol, if you've ever ingested an SSRI, for example, an MAOI, TCA, a tricyclic antidepressant, any psychoactive or psychotropic medication has to pass through the blood-brain barrier, right? So it has to be lipid soluble so it can get in and affect brain function. The cool thing about nitric oxide is it is lipid soluble. So when one of your brain cells releases nitric oxide, it can just pass into other brain cells and signal to them, hey, stuff's happening, right? And so it's a great sort of feedback molecule because it's small and it just slides right through that cell membrane, right? That phospholipid bilayer. So super cool. It is a byproduct of the conversion of L-arginine to L-citrulline. Anybody taking arginine supplements? Again, you don't have to answer that. They sell them all down the like take this pill to get giant aisle, right? Arginine supplements are one of the big supplements for folks who do weightlifting and bodybuilding and stuff. You'll see that. Next time you're at whatever store you go, you can. They're at Kroger. You can go down like in the pharmacy section, where they keep the like dietary supplements, and there's like a ton of these. They're like nitric oxide booster, and it's like full of L-arginine, right? And that's because when you take L-arginine and you turn it into this guy, L-citrulline, you release nitric oxide and you create nitric oxide. Is it helpful? Well, I don't know. Is it hurting you? Well, I don't know. Somebody try it and let's see what happens. So I doubt it's going to be that big of a boost, right? So, although it is helpful for some other things, again, as we discussed, but it is a vasodilator. Okay. Later, I'll give you my 4-step method to bodybuilding. The first 3 are steroids. Vasodilator. Do you want me to write that again? That's for everybody. Apparently one of you, I'm not going to say which one because I have no idea who, could not read the notes I provided on your project feedback, and you had to ask Jake to decipher that. I'm not sure who that was, but my apologies. Was anyone else in that category, but you just didn't send an email? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I wrote a lot of great notes. I worked hard on that. So, all the same. But one of you was brave enough to contact Jake for a translation. So, yeah. So anyway, vasodilator, basically what that means is it takes your blood vessels and fills it up with blood, right? So you can imagine why someone who is bodybuilding would want that, right? Because you can fill your muscles up with blood and then they look full. You can imagine why someone who's got erectile dysfunction would want to use that, right? You can take things that aren't full of blood and then make them full of blood and you can use them. So there you go. Nobody knows anything about erectile dysfunction. A few years ago, Emily, I was the moderator for Psych Jeopardy. We had the Tri-State Psychology Conference. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. One of the questions, the answer was erectile dysfunction. I had 5 teams of students. Everybody had no idea what I was talking about. I asked the question, time ran out. Only one at the time ran out, Zach, and I said, well, the answer was erectile dysfunction. No one knows about that. And some people laughed, and other people continued to deny it. just as you are now. See why only half the class shows up for chapter 10? Yeah. All right, so L-arginine to L-citrulline, bingo. There are multiple sources of nitric oxide in your body. We sort of talked about two places already, right? The sort of periphery, right? Those, it's going to be like your endothelial cells, right? Kind of out and about in your body. And then you have neural nitric oxide synthase. The S is synthase, right? So it creates nitric oxide. So you've got two sources. What's interesting about this is if you have a knockout, and what do we mean by a knockout? We've taken a mouse and we've like deleted genes from it, and then we made that mouse, you know, breed with another mouse, and then their offspring can't produce nitric oxide synthase in their brains, or they can't produce nitric oxide synthase in their endothelial cells, like out and about in their bodies, right? So what we do is we create these knockouts, right? So we have different knockouts. What's interesting about this is if you knock out brain nitric oxide synthase, you actually start to create mice that are more aggressive. If you knock out the nitric oxide synthase in the rest of their body, they actually become more docile, so they become less aggressive. So this is another story of the same molecule, but sort of, you know, because it's nitric oxide, right? So it's all we're talking about. Just this really like simple thing. But depending on its location, it has different effects on your behavior. So there you go. So now you're really wondering about like using nitric oxide supplements for weightlifting, right? Because if you take too many of them, you go in there and you're just like, oh, look at these fun weights. I'm just going to leave them on the rack and not disturb them, instead of going in there and like aggressively like throwing them in the air and like juggling, you know, 45-pound plates or something. Nobody thinks about those things. Zach?
So in a mouse that you like inject with nitrous oxide, it knocks out their ability to naturally produce it.
So what you would do to get a knockout mouse, you actually have to like screw around with their DNA, and then you get like a mother and a father, and you have them breed, and then they have offspring. And those offspring have gene deletions, right? So they're going to not have a gene that creates either brain or body nitric oxide synthase. So that's how that, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's how we get the knockout. If they don't make it in the brain, they're aggressive. If they don't make it in the, if they don't make it in the brain, they're aggressive. If they don't make it in the body, they're docile. Does that make sense? Okay. What about interactions with testosterone? Well, again, if you have testosterone, you're going to be more aggressive either way. There's some interesting things we'll revisit with the endothelial nitric oxide synthase and maternal aggression, which is really going to be fascinating. Hey, what about Siberian hamsters? Anybody know about Siberian hamsters? These guys are crazy. They're typically pretty aggressive. Anybody had a small rodent for a pet? They can be aggressive, right? They can bite. They can fight other things, right? These hamsters have an interesting, so again, this first word is actually pretty important, right? Anybody ever been to Siberia? I didn't think so, right? Where's it located? It's like up toward the top, right? Like of the planet. And that's like the colder part, right? That has longer winters maybe. It doesn't get a whole lot of sunlight all the time, right? And so if you were a species and you sort of developed and evolved in that environment, you might have some like weird season-to-season rhythms, right, compared to someone who's like closer to the equator, right? Okay. And one of the things that these Siberian hamsters do is they, like in the winter, they sort of dial back on everything, right? Because their winters are very long, right? So let's imagine you're a hamster for a moment. I'm going to give you just a moment to center yourselves and imagine you're a hamster, right? And you're scrounging for resources, right? This is one thing you're doing. You're also looking for mates, right? And the problem is breeding is a very energy costly activity, right? Okay, if you've ever, I mean, how many of you have like a house plant? Yeah, so like how hard was that to grow? That's like a lot of work. You got to put water on it, you got to put food in it, sunlight. Now imagine like trying to grow another person. probably takes a lot of energy, right? A lot of resources. So you don't want to just like in the middle of winter when there's no food available, you don't just want to go, hey, hamster honey, let's have a bunch of hamsters, because that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? You don't have the extra resources. So you want to wait until the non-winter time, right? And when food might be more available, and then you're going to go, bingo, now's the time. Let's hurry up and get this done, because we've got a narrow window here to create some other hamsters. So these male Siberian hamsters, they sort of have these oscillations, right, in their testosterone levels, right? And they kind of go up and down throughout the seasons, right? And they're going to go down like in the winter, right? Because that's the non-breeding season, okay? Which makes some sense because you're less likely to be breeding, so testosterone levels can probably go down. You'll still be fine. One of the big reasons that someone would, right, mates, that's a big reason for aggressive behavior. So if it's not mating season, then you could probably reduce your testosterone and effectively. The interesting thing is these hamsters don't actually seem to reduce their aggressive behaviors in the winter. You would think they would, right? Because that major source of aggressive behavior is gone and testosterone goes down. So this is kind of a nuanced story. Their aggression, despite the fact that this is testosterone, right? Their aggression kind of stays the same all the time, right? And it's really kind of an interesting insight into a species that even in non-breeding season needs to maintain its aggressive levels to maintain its survival, right? Because there's still a lot of reason to be aggressive. If you actually take one of these Siberian hamsters and trick it and like expose it to some daylight, like it's the summer, it'll actually start to create more testosterone. It's kind of fun. What about Down syndrome? Why do we put this on here? You guys familiar with Down syndrome? Right? It's a genetic developmental issue. Individuals with Down syndrome tend to show some aggressive behavior sometimes, right? And it seems like that aggressive behavior is actually related to nitric oxide synthase production, right? There's some mouse models of Down syndrome, and what they found is those mice have a reduction in their nitric oxide synthase as well. All right, questions about that? I have one other slide here I don't really want to talk about right now. At some point, we'll talk about like the role of frustration and what happens when you expect a reward but you don't get it, right? Anybody ever been in that situation, right? Somebody said, hey, I need help moving my stuff. And they're like, hey, I'll take you out for a pizza afterward. And then what happens? You moved all their heavy stuff, and they're like, oh, man, I'm tired. I'll see you tomorrow. And you never hear from that person again, right? I've done that a few times to people. That's why I know. So I'm not going to tell you the people I owe for moving me. And then eviction attempts, don't worry about being evicted. I mean, you should worry about being evicted if you're not paying your rent, but don't worry about eviction right now, okay? So questions about that?